Welcome everyone to Methods 2, OU, Spring 2024 semester. We are going to go over the basics of what you need to know to get started on your very first assignment in Rhino 7. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is introduce you to the Rhino Workspace. So the Rhino Workspace starts out with a layout of 4 different screens. We have a top view, a perspective view, a right view, and a front view. These are changeable, these views, but let's just set ourselves up with these 4 as we get started. I'm going to demonstrate what these views are doing by drawing a box here in perspective, so follow along with me. So if you go over here to the left, you have a box button. I'm just going to click on that. And then I'm just going to go over here wherever I want. I'm going to left click, and then I'll start to draw a rectangle. I'm going to left click again, and then I'm going to pull the mouse up, and then left click a third time, and now I have a box. And what you can see here is that this box, you're seeing here, top view, front view, and right view. It's the beauty of Rhino. You can see all the different sides of an element while you're working on it. If I right click with my mouse, I can orbit around this box and look at it in different views. And then if I go over here to this perspective view tab and I click this arrow down, I can change what that box looks like. Shaded is a preferred visualizing command for when you're working. It's going to be the most useful for actually creating things, but there's some other views that are helpful. When you're going through, ghosted gives you sort of an x-ray view. Arctic is a nice view when you have a little bit more complex models. And there's another number of other different views that you can play with, but let's shift ourselves to shaded view. Now you can see what is going on here. So that's sort of the framework of how Rhino works. Now, if you just wanted to work in, say, perspective view, you could double click here on perspective, and it would make the other screens go away. Or you can double click back, see it again. I'm going to go here, and I think this is probably the best place to show you what is going on here in the Rhino space. What you have here is what we call the control plane, and this is the plane that you're working with, also called the C plane, and you've got 2 axes here. You have an X and a Y axis. X axis, Y axis, and then underneath that box is the origin. I'm just going to move the box out of the way. That is the origin. So when you're making a model and you're making something in 2D, you're going to be using the X and Y axis, and if you're making it in 3D, you're going to go into the Z axis. And we'll do a little bit more of that when we get into the 3D modeling, but we're going to start with 2D modeling. So let's get the space set up for a little bit of 2D modeling. So your assignment has you working on a 9-inch by 9-inch grid. So what we want to do is we want to go back to the sheet and let's reset ourselves in top view and get that origin here in the middle. So before we actually start drawing, let's set up a couple things and let's look at some other parts of the workspace. So along here on the left, you have the basic standard tools. So you have some drawing of line work tools up here, some surfaces, some solids, and then some editing tools, moving, copying, etc. And you'll see as you hover the mouse over each of these, it tells you what the commands are. And then if you see here, if any of them have a little triangle in the corner, you can right click and it'll open up a whole other bevy of options. Okay? So always be keeping in mind that there's tools hidden inside the tools for you to use if they have a little triangle. Sometimes it's just that you can left click or right click. So here, for example, is the polyline that we'll be using a lot. And if you look at it, if you hover over it, if you left click, you'll make a polyline, which has multiple lines connected. But let's go back again. If you right click, it'll just give you a line segment. Okay? So the other thing that we have here is the command line. And the command line is really important because Many of the commands that you're going to use, you may want to type rather than find the button. Or sometimes you'll be looking for a command and you'll want to type. So for the polyline example, I could actually type polyline, and it'll actually sort of autofill and guess what I want. And there's my polyline, and then I could start drawing a line with that. Okay, we'll do that in a second. The other thing we have up here is we've got a bunch of tabs. So we've got the standard tab. That's what I usually keep open. It's got your sort of open, close, printing, control, zooms, etc. Your layers tool, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then you have a series of other tabs that do different things depending on what you're working on. You'll probably like the solid tools when we get there. And there's a number of other different tools to look at. And at the very top, you have another set of sort of pull-down menus with similar commands in a different format. So you'll get used to what commands you like and which ones you want to use, depending on what you're doing as you move through the program. Along the bottom, you'll find that you have these commands, which are super important. They're called your O snaps. And if those aren't there, we can set them up in class, but these allow, and you'll see when we start drawing lines, to have the mouse actually snap or connect to parts of lines that already exist. And this is really useful to make all your lines connect when you want them to. We like connecting lines in architecture. Okay, so we've got our commands here, we've got our layout, and then I think the one thing we want to think about is that we have a project where you have to build a 9-inch by 9-inch grid. So that means we want the units of our drawing to be in inches. So in order to check on that, I'm going to type the word units. And when I do that, these units come up. So here, my model units are in inches, but I also want to change a couple of these items. We're just going to match what I have here. And then we want this in feet and inches. That allows you to use 1 foot, 2 inches, etc. And then we're going to change our precision to be super high, just because that's good practice. Okay. So take that units command bar and match this layout. Okay. I think the last thing we want to do is let's pull up our layers command. So if you go up here, you see this little wedge that looks like a piece of patriotic cake. If you click on it, you'll get these layers. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we use layers, but they're very important in terms of organizing your drawings. So keep that open over here and we'll use it in a little bit. Okay, so that should get you all set up to get started making our 9-inch by 9-inch grid. Okay. Okay, now we are going to start in with drawing lines. So, as we mentioned before, we have the command up here, the polyline. So let's just click that button. We could alternatively have typed polyline in. And then let's look and see what the mouse does as we are here. So if you look, you can see that the mouse has a little dot in the middle that's bouncing around this grid. And that is because I have what's called the grid snaps on. So if you look along the bottom here, there's a bunch of different items that are, some of them are in bold and some of them are not. And these are items that you can also toggle on and off that will help you draw at different times. So let's leave the grid snap on for right now. And let's try to, what it allows us to do is click right here in the middle at that origin. So now if I try to draw right now, my line is only going up and down or left and right. And that is because I have this command, ortho, on. And watch what happens if I unclick it. Ortho loosens up, and now I can draw anywhere I want. Okay? So in this case, because we're drawing a grid, I want to keep that ortho on. So I'm going to click that back on. So you'll find these tools are helpful depending on what you're doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take that line where I clicked in the middle and then just drag it to the right, and then I'm just going to left click right here. And now see what happens is I have another line if I want to use it, but I actually don't. I just want one line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click here, and now I just have one line. Okay. Now we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to draw a line up. We can zoom back, use the mouse to zoom in and out, click on the origin, and then we can go all the way up, left click here, and then right click to make that line go away. Now we have two lines. If we want to select those lines, we can go over here to the little arrow, select the line, and when I select it, it turns yellow. And when it turns yellow, we get these little guys. And if you don't see those, you want to go to the bottom. That is called the gumball. If I unclick the gumball, they go away. If I click them, they come back. The gumball is one of my most favorite tools. Make friends with the gumball. It will make your life much easier. So the gumball allows you to move things around in space. So if I click on this arrow, it will just drag this line directly along one axis. If I want to go up and down, I can drag it along the other axis. And I'll show you how this is useful in a minute. If I want that line to go back where I wanted it in the first place, I just undo what I was doing and I hit Control Z. That's another command that will be your friend, is Control Z. All right, now it's back at the origin. So since we're building a 9 by 9 square grid, what I want to start with is building the frame on the outside of the grid. So let's make a 9-inch by 9-inch box, and then we'll put a grid inside of that. So how do we make a 9-inch by 9-inch box? It means I have these two lines, we need to make a copy of them that's 9 inches in both directions. So there's a couple of different ways we could do that. If I select this line, I could make a copy. So if we go over here, we have the copy command, and there's two ways to make a copy. You can just make a copy. I'm just going to click with my left button, the regular copy, and I can click it and then just move it wherever. But if I do that, I don't necessarily have control of how far I'm clicking it. I mean, you can see there's some controls there, but that's a relatively arbitrary distance. Okay, so I don't really want to do that. What I'd rather do is actually make a copy of this line, put it right on top of the other line, and then use the gumball to move it over exactly how much I want. So let's go over to that copy button, and instead of clicking left, click right, which is called copy in place. And then if I click on this right gumball arrow, click on it, then I can type in exactly how much I want this line to be moved. So in this case, I want to go 9 inches, 9 inches, which is very small, because I just kind of drew this line arbitrarily. All right, so let's do the same thing on this bottom line. Let's right click over copy. We could also type the word copy, and then if you look up here, we could click in place, and it would make a copy in place. So now there's two lines there, and if I go to click on it, you can see there's two lines. And then I'll take that other element, type in 9 inches, and now I have two lines that are 9 inches apart. And if I zoom all the way back in here, this is my 9-inch by 9-inch grid. Now, right now I've got a couple of things selected on my O-snaps. I've got my endpoints, my midpoints, my intersections, and I'll show you how that's useful, because what I want to do is let's double check that these distances are what we want them to be. And the way we do that is we can type the word distance, and then it'll ask us for a point. Always look up at the command line to see what it's asking you. So I click here, and then I can click here, and it's going to tell me that those are 9 inches apart. Right? I can do the same command. If I hit enter, it will repeat my last command. If I click here, and then here, 9 inches. Okay, so that's great. So I've got a 9-inch square here, but now I've got all this extra line that I want to get rid of. So the way we're going to get rid of it is we're going to use what's called the trim command. And the trim command is basically like taking a pair of scissors and cutting a line here and getting rid of this. So it like cuts it and throws it away all in one move. So the trim command, you can either type the word trim, or you can click here onto trim. And it's going to ask you some questions up here in the command line. Select cutting objects. So this is our cutting object. That's what we want, to get rid of things on this side and keep things on this side, which makes this our cutting object. So let's click on it. And when we're done, we hit enter, or we right click, and then it says select object to trim. So what do we want to get rid of? We want to get rid of this part of the line, and we're going to get rid of this part of the line. It's pretty great. All right, let's do the same thing over here. Let's click trim. This is our cutting object again. And then these are the two, I went too fast. That's our cutting object. Then we hit enter. Then we click get rid of this, and we get rid of this. All right, now we have a box. It's 9 inches by 9 inches. So that is great. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to make the grid inside of the box. So to make the grid inside of the box, what we need to do is copy this line over a bunch of times, 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch. So I'm going to show you 2 different ways to do that. So we can use that copy in place again. So we can click this line. We can copy it in place. Let's right click. And then we can use the gumball. And here, instead of typing 9, let's type 1. Okay. Now we've got 1 inch. And we could do that a bunch of times. Copy in place. Objects to copy. And then we click on it. And then we move it 1 inch. Another thing we could do is, now that we have a grid started, we know that we've got this 1 inch spacing going. We could also select an object. Now we can use the regular copy, left click, and then we want to move this 1 inch each time. I'm actually going to go back a line. I'm going to click here, and then I'm going to click to the end of that line, then to the end of that line. See how the previous line I drew gives me equal spacing all the way across. Now I have a grid going that way. So that's, you can use the copy command to do that. A different way to do that is to use another of my favorite commands. You're going to think all of my commands are my favorites because I say it all the time, but these are the good ones. Offset. So offset is going to take a line and move it a certain distance away from the original line. So here I'm going to say my distance is 1, so I could type in 1. And then if I click this line, see how it'll show me the option. I could either put an offset on this side or on that side, but I want it inside my grid, and it copies it. So then I want to do that again. Click, offset, click, offset, click, offset, right? So I could keep doing that over and over again. Now, I also have a bunch of lines. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 lines here, and then I can tell by my grid I need to put 1, 2, 3, 4 more lines over here. So the other thing I could do is, instead of copying one thing at a time, is I could copy a bunch of things at a time. So let's select a number of objects. So I'm going to go grab my arrow here, and then there's 2 ways that this arrow works. If I click from the left-hand side, and then I drag to the right, see how the box that I'm dragging is solid? If I put those lines fully inside the box, it'll select them. Now watch what happens if I start to select only part of them. Nothing works, right? So if I go left to right, I have to put the whole object in the box. Now watch what happens if I go right to left. Now it'll just select the objects that it touches, right? So I could do this and select those 4, right? There's just a bunch of different ways to select objects, but the point is I want to select those 4 objects, and then I want to take that copy, and here I'm going to copy from this point, and then move it up to here. And now I have a 9 square grid, right? Good. Okay, now that you have your 9-inch grid, let's talk about what you can do within it. Now is when you get to actually have a little bit of fun and start to create your pattern. So what I would recommend is you have one 9 square grid, you have to create 3 different patterns. So I would select this grid, and I would make 3 copies of it. And you can just spread them out because digital space is infinite. And then you can start to work into each of these grids and create the pattern you want. So now, this is where your snaps and your O-snaps and your different layers become very important. So now we've got the main grid. Now let's talk about layers a little bit. So if we go over here, you can see we've been using the default layer, and you can tell that's the default layer because it's black, right? Then there's a number of different layers here with different colors. And if you double click on the layer name, you can rename it. And I like, for this assignment, to name my names by line types. So let's make a couple line types right now. So we're going to make a heavy line type. So that would be like a thick line. So I'm just going to call it heavy/thick. I'm going to make another one called medium, one called light, and then I'm going to make one called gray, and one called dashed. All right, so these are the different line types that you can use for your assignment. And remember, I think you have to use at least 3 of them for the final. Now watch what happens. See how dashed has a check next to it? Let's click on this heavy/thick line. So right now it's red. So if I go to draw a line and say maybe I want to turn my ortho off because I'm tired of drawing straight lines. If I want to draw a line that's a diagonal, now, let's try it again. Left click, right click. Now I have a red line. And then let's try if I do medium. Let's just make a quick pattern here. So I'm right clicking to repeat the last command. Okay, now I have a grid with a bunch of different line weights. Now watch what happens when I turn the light bulb on and off. Right? So when I turn the light bulb on and off, I can start to see different lines and different weights. So this allows you to have control. So you could create a design that's fully based on that grid, like the one I just drew. But if you turn the grid off, all you'd see are the diagonals, right? You don't have to see the grid to perceive the grid, right? So that allows you to kind of play with the different lines and do different things. And so, thinking about using your offset commands, we used 1 inch. You could now do something like 1/4 of an inch. And start to offset these lines and make different patterns with them. And as they extend outside the grid, we can come back and use that trim command again. Get rid of those extra lines. Okay. Then we start to see a pattern emerge, right? So you need a lot more lines for a pattern for this assignment, but you can see that as we start to use this grid, we can start to make different patterns, okay? So then let's look at a couple other things we can do with the layer tool. We could also, if I click on a layer and then I right click, you get a whole bunch of different property options. So let's see, let's select the objects, see what happens. So when I clicked on medium, it selected these lines that were purple. Say now I decided I want those to be gray instead. So then I could click on the gray layer, right click, and do change object layer. And then if I hit escape, now you can see it changed those lines that were once purple, now they're green. Right? So you can control the layers, use different things to turn them on and off. Okay? I'm going to change this back to purple so we have one of each. All right, and then let's expand this layer box a little bit so you can see what else is going on here. So since we're going to be printing, we have a couple things that are important to us here. So this assignment, everything has to be either black or gray. So let's go in. I'm going to change this default layer. I'm going to call it grid. Okay. So we've got a couple options here. Here we have print color. So let's go in and make, like, we can highlight all of these and change them so they're print color. If I click on that, it gives me this color layer. Print color can be black. But then we do have this layer called gray. So let's go in and just change that one to gray. Okay. And then here, all of our line types are, right now, they're continuous. So continuous is just your standard, regular, solid line. But here we have a dashed line. So let's see if we can change that to dashed. And a lot of times we call dashed lines hidden lines, and that's an architecture term. We use it to show things that are behind things, so they're hidden. So we use hidden. And see when I did that? See how it changed that line to dashed. That's pretty cool. And then let's do one more thing. So we're going to look at our print widths. So if we want something to be heavy, we're going to change the print widths of each of those. So let's set that up. Okay, so our print width is what makes the lines have different thicknesses. So what we want to do is come in here and change them to have very specific thicknesses. So I'm going to tell you a good starting point for these lines. And these you can change, but I'm going to make my heavy line a 2, so you can see visually the differences as you go through here. I make my heavy lines a 2. I'm going to make my medium lines a 0.8. And I'm going to make my light lines a 0.13. And then I'm going to make my gray line the same as my medium line. And I'm going to make my dashed line also the same as my medium line. Okay? So if you set your lines up like this, then we're going to go to the print screen and see what that actually looks like. So the next step is to go in and create what we call a layout sheet. And that will allow you to put your drawings onto an 11 by 17 sheet to turn in. Okay, so to create a print layout, you are going to want to go to the bottom of this sheet. And if you go all the way to the right to this plus, these are your tabs you remember from the beginning. If you go here to the right to the plus, you can go in here and create a new layout. And then let's follow these steps. So we're going to call this, let's give it a name, we'll call it pattern 1. We want the Rhino PDF printer, and then we want to set the size to be an 11 by 17 landscape. Okay, so it's going to give you a bunch of different options here. You want to choose 11 by 17, and we want landscape. Okay, so just select that, and then I don't know why that didn't hold. Pattern number 1. Hit OK. And then here you can see, I'm just going to move my layers over and make them a little smaller for the moment. Here you can see we have a sheet. We have a tab here that says pattern 1, and right now we can see all 3 patterns. Now, see how there's this white line here? That is the layout space. So watch what happens if I double click into it. Now suddenly I can see my drawing. So what I'm going to do is if I hold down the mouse scroll button, it brings up my pan tool. So I can move my mouse. I can zoom in and out using the mouse wheel till I get that pattern as big as I want on the page. So maybe not all the way giant, but pretty big. Okay. So I can zoom in with the ruler. I can also use, if you go up to the standard tools, you could use the zoom window. If you click on this, it allows you to draw a box, and it'll zoom and center. And then maybe I want to pan it to the left. Okay? It's up to you how big you want this to be. So this is one of the things we'll start to look at in this class is how to compose a whole sheet. But for now, let's get it nicely on the sheet so that we can enjoy it, right? Once you have it where you want, you can double click out of that and it'll go back to this layout. And then what we want to do is we want to actually see it in the black and white version. So let's click here on this pattern 1, see what else we can see up here. So right now, you see our layout. Let's try what happens if we see the print preview. Look at how awesome that looks. So now you can suddenly see all of those line weights that we set up over here in the layers on that sheet. Just to prove how they work, if you go here, say we want to change one of the print widths. Let's make that one crazy and see what happens. We just made that a 4, and now it's super, super wide. Okay? I change that back to 2 because I'm not crazy. And now we have this grid layout. Now remember, you can turn on and off those grids so you can see what you want on this layout. And now you have a sheet with black and white drawings, and I think we can even see, you can see it very, very lightly here. You can see the gray lines, but when we actually go to print it, it'll be on a white background, so you'll actually be able to see those gray lines. But a little hint, we like to make our gray lines a little bit thicker because they tend to disappear in their lightness. So now that we have that, let's look at a couple other things that we can do here. We can go in and we can actually print this, and I think we can print it from down here. So if we right click, we have a print box. And if you go to print, it'll give you a little preview that's set up like this. Rhino tabloid, all of that stuff. And then you can hit print. And then it'll ask you for a name. I'm just going to put this on my desktop. And I'm going to call it pattern 1 test. Save it. And then, let's see, it should be something I can open in my Acrobat. Here's your assignment in Acrobat. Let's see what we can open. Pattern 1 test. And look at that. So that is a good test. Now you can see how nice those gray lines come out. And that looks fantastic. Okay, now that we have our print layout and we know that it's printing the way we want it, I think the last thing we need to do is put the text onto the drawing that is part of the assignment, and then we can set this up to do the other two patterns. So the easiest way to do text in Rhino, which is not actually the best program to do text in, but for now we're going to use this, and then we'll show you other ways to do it later. I type in text, and this box will come up, and you have to choose a couple things. You have to make some guesses, and you can always come back and change these things, but how tall you want the text to be. I think a good rule of thumb is that you want the text to be, for titles, somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch tall. So let's stick with 1/4 of an inch and see what it looks like. And you can see I already wrote in pattern 1 here. So pattern 1. Pick a nice contemporary font, something nice and modern. I like Arial Italic. So let's see what happens. We type pattern 1. Okay. All right. That's pretty good. Now let's see, what else do we need to say? We need to say the type of pattern. So let's do text again. And then we're going to say this is maybe eventually it will be a radial organization. We can move these around later, but let's get the text in there and then we can rearrange it. And then we'll do text again, and we'll call it gradation, which is probably pretty accurate for those diagonals. So now we have these, and then you can see right now it's snapping. Let's turn our grid snap off. And then we can start to move these guys around. And then again, that's your gumball. Look how nice it is. So useful. You can select a couple of these at the same time if you hold Shift down. Maybe you decided you wanted that to be a little bit bigger. You could use the command scale. And you could actually make that a little larger. These are up to you. These are design choices. Be creative. And then you also have to put in your name. So that's my name. Let's see what else was in the assignment. Surprise, I don't have the assignment memorized. So let's see. Name, course number, assignment number, date. So methods 2, 12, 63, 1. Okay. Now we've got all of that. And then I'm going to show you a trick to make all of that work together and be smaller, and that is the group command. So if I type the word group, it actually allows me to watch what happens. Now if I click on it, I can move them all together, which is great. If I want to put some stuff in the corner, if I want to scale that to make it a little bit smaller, it works as a group. And then if I change my mind and I don't want them together, I can type the word ungroup. And then I could do something like, say I wanted to do that. Okay. It is up to you. right? That's kind of nice because then you've got your name and the class here. Assignment 1, Part 1. Here's your pattern. Maybe we do the same thing here. Slide that down. That looks pretty cool. Let's try to print that again. Here we can go from File and do Print. Print. Pattern 1, Test 2. It's helpful to name your files well because then it's less confusing. So let's see what we've got. Right? Look at that. That looks pretty great. Okay, so this is what I'm looking for class, due in class next week, but you're going to do this 3 times. You're going to create 3 patterns, and you're going to lay them out on a sheet, and you're going to turn in 1 PDF where the PDF is combined. So let's go through that last step of creating 2 more layouts, and then you can get working on your patterns. Okay. Okay, so now we have this sheet and we're super happy with it. And I recommend getting all the way through 1 sheet and then using that format to lay out the other 2 because it's going to save you a boatload of time. So what I want to do now is I want to copy this layout to another sheet, and then I'll move that viewport so I can see a second pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to this pattern number 1, and I'm going to click it here. And then I'm going to go up here to move. I right-clicked, and I'm going to go to Move to, or Copy. And then I'm going to click on Pattern 1, click Create a Copy, and hit OK. And then you can see it made 2 copies. So I'm going to rename this one called Pattern number 2. Hit Enter. And now I have Pattern 1 and Pattern 2, and they are identical right now. So let's go in and let's edit this text. So I can double click on that text and go in and change it. Now it says Pattern 2. And then, remember how we got the pattern here in the first place? I can double click here. And then let's use that pan tool. So you can type in pan. And then we can just slide the sheet over. And get that second layout right here. Okay. And then you are in good shape there. And then we can do this one more time. Not rename. We want to make a copy. I'm in a command. Okay, so we're going to do this one more time. We're going to make a copy. We'll rename, call it Pattern 3. And then we'll double click on that, change the text to Pattern 3. Come in here, use the pan tool, type in pan, and slide that window over until we get to that third layout. Okay, now if I want to go back and draw some more from here, I'll go to the top view, and I can double click here on top view, and now I can see all my grids. So if I came in, let me turn my layers back on, do something here in red. If I wanted to come in here, and I'm going to show you a little trick with rectangles. So instead of drawing a line here, if I want to come in and draw a rectangle, I could click here on the rectangle tool, and then you could see here to there. And if I turn my grid off, you can see that I drew a rectangle. Now sometimes There we go. Now we can see that. And then we can come into that rectangle. Let's try to do some of that offsetting. Let's offset it 0.25. See, if I do that, see how it'll actually copy and offset the whole rectangle instead of just the line. And then let's see. Let's try that again. And say I want to offset it an even smaller amount. Let's say 1/8 of an inch. Click, right click, offset, click, command again, right click, offset, click. And then watch what happens if I turn my grid off. Ooh, right? Start to see some good stuff. Now, watch if I go back to my pattern number 2. Now, we can see some crazy stuff is starting to happen, right? Because we can preview this. So see how the line weights and the spacing, look at all that depth that you're getting out of that. Now, if I wanted to edit even right in here, I could double click. Say I want to come in and offset a bigger amount here. And then I'm done with that. Let's do this. Now, look at that. That looks pretty cool. So, the other thing I can do is I could turn off the grid. It actually looks questionably better with the grid, right? It's up to you. It's your design, right? So that would be a different set of guidelines. But you can see as you change it in the top view, it also changes in your pattern view, right? I'm going to show you one more thing. Let's grab those lines. We're going to select those objects. Say I like that pattern and I wanted to use it on here. Maybe I can copy it. I copy it from this point to that point. Oops, I accidentally copied that diagonal line. I can just delete it, click on it, and then hit delete. And then here, let's turn that grid off. And say you wanted to come in and rotate some things. So here's the rotate tool. So I'm just going to see what happens here. Say I want to rotate from that corner. Here's my circle. I'm going to turn my ortho on. Say I just want to rotate that 45. No, let's do 30 degrees. Now I have a pattern. Let's go to pattern 3. Now I have a pattern where things are starting to look a little bit different. Right? Think about the different things you could do once you start to rotate and shift things. Watch. If I could use that trim command, I could come in here, use that as cutting objects, and then start to get rid of anything that's in between here and here. Now look how I'm going right to left and just selecting those surfaces. Look at that. Now let's try that again. Let's use the trim again. Let's go over here. And then right click. Let's trim a couple of those out. Those out. Now let's see what that looks like here. That looks pretty cool. Maybe I want all of these to be light lines. So I go to my light layer, change object layer, double click, crazy. Okay, so infinite options. Maybe I change my mind and I'd rather that be gray. Hard to read in this version, but they're there. All right, so there's lots and lots and lots of ways. If you don't like that, you can just hit undo. If you don't like that, you can hit undo again. Okay, so I open you all to explore all of your many different creative ideas through line drawings for this assignment. Okay? Thank you very much, and good patterning.